For the oral history collections of the Fashion Institute of Technology, this will be an interview with Jeannette Jarnow, Jarnaow, professor of fashion buying and merchandising. The date is November 1st, 1984. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. Professor Jarnow, you became Professor Emeritus just very recently, and up until then you had been for a number of years the Edwin Goodman Professor. But would you, before we go into your story at FIT, could we hear about yourself, where you were born and what your interests were when you were young and so on?
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I don't think I ever thought, in fact, if I remember when I went to college, my mother thought I should become a teacher, and I said, that's the last thing I'll ever do in my life, and it looks like it is the last thing I'm doing in my life, because I never had any intention of teaching. When I went to school, I went to Barnard, graduated Barnard in 1930, and I was a psych major. And when I graduated Barnard, I had planned on entering a psych clinic, following a career in psychology. And I remember that at Barnard, a gal, an alumnus of Barnard by the name of Lillian Friedman, who was then training director of Abraham and Strauss, came to talk to the students about career opportunities, and she talked about retailing, and she talked about the fact that they were doing a great deal of aptitude testing in Abraham and Strauss, and I was very interested in aptitude testing as a psychological device at that time, and so I decided that that was going to be the place for me. I applied to Abraham and Strauss for their training squad and made it.
Incidentally, in those days you were Jeannette Jarnow. I take it you were not yet married when you went to A&S.
No. And I think I spent, after my training period at Abraham and Strauss, maybe 1 month in the training department, and I decided that the action was not up there, and I didn't want to be confined to an office, and that the action was on the floor, and that's how I got into merchandising.
Okay.
So,
what department did you go into, or how did you get into merchandising?
well, I went into the training program at Abraham and Strauss, was assigned for a short time at my request in the training department to do psych testing. And when I went down on the floor, I think the first position I had was an assistant buyer in something that was then called moderate price dress departments. And I was made a buyer within 2 years of that moderate price dress department. Now, during my career at A&S's, I was a buyer in the moderate price dress department. I then became a buyer of the junior dress department. When they expanded to junior dresses, there was a vacancy in the junior coat department. I then bought for both junior dresses and junior coats. And when the sportswear field came into being, and there was no such thing as junior sportswear at that point, we created a junior subdivision in our ready-to-wear division, and I merchandised and bought with several assistants for the junior dress department, the junior coat department, and what was the beginning then of a junior sportswear department. As a matter of fact, many years, I don't know how many years really when it happened, I thought that maybe I really should have pursued a career in psych. So I took a leave from the store and went to a psychological institute where I did testing, and I decided again that this was not what I really wanted, and I went back to Abraham and Strauss. So I was at Abraham and Strauss I'm not even sure when I quit Abraham and Strauss. It must have been in 1944, and I became pregnant, and I quit to have 2 children.
Mm-hmm. You had been married when?
I was married in 1933.
I see.
And I never had any children until 11 years after we were married. I think what decided me to have children is that my husband was drafted, and I thought if he's going off to Europe, that was my last chance. So I became pregnant, had one child in 44, and knew after a couple of months, or maybe even a month or two, that if I ever was going to have a second child, I better do it quickly because I was going to go back to work.
Mm-hmm.
So
you really were one of the early mothers in a career situation.
Yeah. Well, I was very fortunate. My mother lived with me, which made it very easy to do. So I had another child in 45. I decided I wanted to go back to work, but I wanted to go back to work part-time. And Abraham and Strauss offered me a position working at that point. Every buyer works, I mean, it was a 6-day-a-week job in the 45 or so. And I wanted to work, I had my own ideas. I wanted a real part-time job. I only wanted to work 5 days a week. I wanted to work only part of the day, and they were not willing to give me that. But there was a man by the name of Mr. Nelson Miller, who had been a vice president of Abraham and Strauss, and he became president of NAM Loges in Brooklyn. And he was very eager to get Abraham and Strauss people. And while I had never worked for him, we kind of made a deal. I was going to work 5 days a week from 10 to 4. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, or he wasn't sure. I was willing to take a substantial cut in salary.
What were salaries like then?
I think maybe I was earning $150 a week when I quit Abraham and Strauss, but I can tell you that I got married when I was a buyer in 1933, and I think I was earning $75 a week. And that was a pretty top salary because that was at the height of the Depression. I think I was earning more than my husband, who owned his own business.
Right.
I guess you remember those days
I
too.
do indeed.
So he agreed to let me work, we weren't quite sure what, 5 days a week, 10 to 4, and in the summers, 1 day a week, because I wanted to be with my children.
And so you did indeed manage to make that deal and stay with it.
I stayed with that until from it was in 1948 that I joined NAM Loges, and I stayed with them until 1955 when I decided I wanted to do something else, which was teaching.
Mm-hmm. Could we just talk a little bit more about your job with NAM Loges before we come to FIT? For example, was this a store that had branches? Were there such things?
They opened
a
up
store
the
that
first
size?
branch during the time I was there.
Mm-hmm.
When I started there, I sort of worked out of his office. And what he had done, NAM Loges, strangely enough, was had a computerized unit control system, which was very elaborate, much more elaborate than really they needed. And when he came into the store, he threw the whole thing out. And what happened was he left the store without any inventory control systems, unit control systems. So that was my first assignment, to reinstate some type of unit control systems, and that's what I did. Then the next assignment I had was to work with their junior buyer, who was a very bright gal, to try to help her and help NAM Loges develop their junior business, which was not doing as well as it should, despite the fact that she was a very capable buyer. And then I'm not sure exactly, maybe I was there a year doing the inventory control and working with this junior buyer. when one day he said to me, "How would you like to merchandise the main floor?" And I said, "There's no way I can merchandise the main floor working 10 to 4, 5 days a week and one day in the summer." And he said, "We'll see." And I remember coming into work the following day and everybody was congratulating me because he made me a merchandise manager of the main floor. And that's, I had told him no, or I didn't think so. And the only reason I was able to merchandise the main floor and do it on such a part-time basis is that I was reporting to they had divided they had a general merchandise manager, and then they had appointed a vice president of merchandising of softwares, ready-to-wear, or soft, and another one of hardware.
Was Nam Lowe's just a department store or a
department store?
It was a department store.
And I reported to him, and he was willing to cover for me. In other words, if I worked from 10 to 4, and at 5 o'clock my buyers needed an order signed, they would then go to him and he would take care of it. And the same thing happened during the summers. When I spent the summers out, I think, at Fire Island. This was quite an arrangement. I would come in on Tuesdays to do my open to buy with my buyers, to do my sales promotion plans, because I was a divisional at that point. And on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I guess the following Monday, in terms of signing orders, in terms of any problems coming up with advertising, this vice president in charge of merchandising soft lines covered for me. So
That was a very unusual arrangement.
A very unusual arrangement. And I did that for, and I pretty much stuck to those hours. Sort of. Of course, I took a lot of work home. But that was my own business. In other words, when I used to work from so-called 10 to 4, what I did from after hours at home, whether I was doing merchandising work or sales promotion planning or anything else, I was doing that at home. And so it worked out, and on the summers it really was only Tuesdays.
Were you being paid as though you were working a full-time job?
Oh, at that point, my salary had been raised considerably, because I was merchandising the main floor, and the main floor was growing like crazy. I had a good bunch of buyers, and we really did a great job down there. We made history, quote, in some departments, where I remember we had a sale in the blouse department, and we hit a $5,000 day, which in those days for us was a little unusual, and we had never hit I don't think we'd ever hit anything over 1,000 in those days. I had a very good buyer working for me, a fellow by the name of Lewis Davis. I don't know if you ever knew Lou Davis, who later went to Macy's, became
Was he LEWIS?
Yes, he was a GMM at Burdine's in Miami. I think he then became president of a store, and he was a bright guy. So without good buyers, I'm sure you've been in business, you know this, you couldn't do it. Anyhow, somewheres around 55, my kids were growing up. They got to be 9 and 10, and even though my hours were not that full from Nam Loges, I felt that I wanted to spend more time at home. So I got the idea. I went to see, actually I got my job at FIT through people at A&S's. I went to see some of my friends at Abraham and Strauss, and they told me there was a school called FIT, a college that was beginning, and they were looking for people and to teach. And they had been on the FIT advisory board to start with, and FIT was planning a curriculum in merchandising. And so it was through Abraham and Strauss that but before I remember, along with that, I decided it would be lovely to teach one course somewhere at a college. I went to see Mr. Edwards, School of Retailing, NYU, and he told me I would need a master's. I remember going to see Mr. Axelrod, who was running a program at Brooklyn College, and this was in the spring. He told me that they didn't have any openings. And that was at the time that Mr. Brown of Abraham and Strauss, either, I don't remember whether they called me or I called them. That's how I made contact at FIT. And when I quit NAMS in January or February. January, they asked me to stay through Christmas. And I registered for a master's.
January of what year?
January 56.
Mm-hmm.
I had decided that in 55 to tell them I was leaving. They asked me to, handle the Christmas season.
Right.
And I left in January, and I registered at a school called Long Island University, which frankly, I took my master's there. It was a pretty terrible school then. I'm sure it's improved a great deal. But I certainly didn't want to travel all the way up to Columbia Business School. And NYU told me I could not start in February. I would have to start in the following September, and I wanted to start on a master's. So I enrolled at Long Island University for a master's, started it with daytime courses that spring of 56, and then had an interview with FIT.
Speak. You had an interview with FIT.
FIT at that point, my first interview was with Rosalind Snyder, who was the dean at that point, and she told me they were not looking really for a teacher. What they were looking for was somebody to head a department, and start a department. Well, I really wasn't anxious to start a department. I was just looking for a challenging job that wasn't going to take up too much time. But when I was interviewed by Dr. Bethel, to whom she sent me, he didn't think I had a well-known enough name for fashion. I think he was looking for somebody whose name was extremely well-known per se for fashion, either a famous designer, a famous magazine editor. And as I once told Dr. Bethel at that point, a little bit later, at that point, I think to them it was more important who you knew than what you knew. Anyhow, he really didn't want me. Rosalind Snyder wanted me very badly. I found out later. But they didn't hire me until June, I think it was about June 15th, 1955. And I was supposed to...
55 or 50?
56, excuse me. And I was supposed to start working in September and start a department by September. And I was going away the following week with my family for the summer. And I remember asking Rosalind, how do you start a department if I'm going to teach courses? What do I do? And she said to me, well, I guess the first thing you do is do courses of study for the courses you like to teach or think should be taught. And I said to her, what's a course of study? Because I really didn't have any idea what a course of study was. And she said, I would love to spend some time with you, Jeannette, but number one, you're going away, and number two, we are in the middle of accreditation. And our accrediting team is coming in, and I absolutely have no time. So I said, well, just give me some sample courses of study, and I'll work it out myself. And that's exactly what I did. I think I went away for the summer with some sample courses of study, and I think all I did was develop one or two courses, because actually when I started, I was the head of the department, the foot of the department, and the middle of the department. I was a one-person department. I had no title whatsoever. And we really didn't plan a curriculum. We sort of planned it as we went along. And it was an interesting experience, I must tell you. They had admitted 25 students. I came into the school. The school was then located on the main floor, and I believe the top two floors of the High School of Fashion Industries, or the Needle Trades High School. And I remember coming in September. The room and time had been planned by the dean's office. So when I came in, I knew I was going to meet 25 students. I came in prepared with several courses, 2 courses probably, because they took other things besides in liberal arts. And I didn't even have an office. I had a half a desk on the main floor of the Needle Trades High School, but we were all jammed in. And that's how we got going. And I guess it was we didn't think about recruiting we didn't add any additional teachers. I was told that we were going to admit 50 students in 57, and therefore I could get another teacher. And I remember how I got the other teacher. They had talked to me about a Dr. Sloan who had also applied for my job. Mm-hmm. And he was an experienced teacher. He was teaching up at Orange County Community. So I wrote him a letter in which the letter asked him if he knew anybody that I could get another teacher, but between the lines I was really asking him if he would come. And he sort of got the message, and he wanted to come back to New York. He had applied for my job, but they hadn't given it to him. And that's how we got our second teacher.
Now that's for this particular program, right? Because in 1944,
there wasn't any merchandising program.
Right, okay, because there were 100 students and 20 teachers, or 10 teachers rather, but that was just for design and
that
production.
Was for design and production.
Right, okay.
The merchandising department did not start until 56.
Right, okay.
And we had 25 students that entered for the merchandise program. And then there was a second class in 56 of design students who in their second year were given the option of taking a merchandising track. So I was teaching students who came in for merchandising, who were going to be there for 2 years, plus a class of students who had come in there for design and who had switched their so-called major. Mm-hmm. And that's how we got started. And for the first few years, we had only one other full-time teacher.
In your department?
In my department. But we did use a lot of part-time teachers. In fact, Abraham and Strauss, when we wanted to put in an advertising course, loaned us one of their advertising people. A gal, you may even know her, Gilda Smithline.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Bill Toby, who was the head of the advertising sales promotion department at FIT, released Gilda to come over and teach in our school 2 mornings a week. Mm-hmm. We had other part-timers. Incidentally, many of them had been at Abraham and Strauss. Another gal that taught a course there who had retired from Abraham and Strauss taught for us part-time. Betty Tepper, who's been here a long time, taught for us part-time. So we really functioned for many years with 2 full-timers, several part-timers, and the strange part of it is I cannot seem to remember when we added our next full-timer, but it was at least 5 or 6 years, at least, after the department started. So it might not have been, though I'm not sure of it, early 60s, that we added a third part-timer. And of course, in the 60s, we grew like crazy. Those of us in the department did a lot of publicizing of FIT. For example, I think Dr. Sloan, and anybody else that was there part-time, we decided we'd write a letter to all the people we knew in industry and enclose an FIT brochure. We did a lot of other things in terms of, on our field trips we called a lot of concerns,
You did field trips visiting manufacturers?
Visiting
and
manufacturers,
textile
visiting retailers a lot, and publicizing. We did our own publicity, really. At least I think we did a lot of it. As we went along, we did a lot of publicity. For example, it must have been, I'm not even sure the date, but it was sometime in the late 60s, when we thought it would be a great idea to invite all the personnel people in from all the retailers around New York, chains and stores, and at that time we had added other teachers, and we put on a show. We put on a musical show that was really great. What it was doing was saying, we have a merchandising department at FIT, here's what we do in our classes, and we did that with all the personnel people. And we really got tremendous response, because those personnel people were the ones that were going to hopefully give our students jobs and get to know FIT. We got an idea that it would be wonderful if every student, for example, could spend a day in the market with a buyer. So since all of us who were teaching at that time, part-timers as well, had had industry experience, we set up a minimum requirement. In other words, we would hire, and we felt that anybody that was coming into school to teach full or part had to have a minimum of 6 years of experience in the industry at the executive level. Well, the minute you do that at the executive level, you know, they've been in industry a lot longer than 6 years. So none of us...
At least in those days. Nowadays, things...
Nowadays, they get to be executives maybe in a much shorter time. But, for example, we thought that would be wonderful. So we proceeded to make a lot of calls to resident buying offices, mostly because to send our students with a day in the market with a buyer, because the resident buyers, as you know, are in the markets all day long, whereas at that time store buyers were not spending that much time in the market. You know, they had a lot of responsibilities for store duties. Right. And one of the things we remember is when the students would go out for this so-called day in the market, we would release them from other classes to spend a day in the market with a buyer, and they would come back and say, but nobody ever heard of FIT. And I remember we'd say, they will someday hear of FIT, because we really were not that well known. I remember doing an article for Stores Magazine, which they published. I can't remember exactly what topic it was on. I did several for Stores Magazine, but it wasn't because I had any great desire to write. It was because I signed it, Jeannette Jarnow, FIT, and at least everybody got to know what more people were being exposed to the name of Fashion Institute of Technology. So along with the school's office efforts at publicity, we were doing our own publicity in our own department. Another thing we did in cooperation, I think, with the recruitment office or the student office was invite in guidance counselors from high school. And at that point, we could tell them, because very few people really knew what merchandising was. You know, I once heard merchandising explained as a big word in search of a meaning. I mean, nobody was ever quite sure what merchandising is all about. And so when we brought in these guidance counselors, clarify what merchandising is all about, what the career opportunities were, and what we were doing in school. And so they say, along with FIT, we did our own efforts at recruitment, and I think we had a lot of input into getting our own students.
What was a student body like when you arrived here in '56? For example, were these people
I'm trying to think. They were good. They really...
I mean, were they people whose families had been involved in any way in the industry?
I think then, and even to this day, we do get students whose families have been involved, not so much in retailing, but rather in manufacturing. Though we do get children then and even now of people whose parents have small stores. I don't remember getting, sons and or daughters of corporate people, but small entrepreneurs who had little retail stores, and they sent them to our school. But I don't think that was the bulk of our students.
What was the bulk?
The bulk of our students, strangely enough, were not even from New York. We got many Jersey students. We always had a problem getting boys, because I think boys then and even to this day are turned off by the word fashion. So that I would guess the majority of our students by far were people from Long Island, Westchester, Jersey, not too many New York students. Another interesting thing about the merchandising department at FIT is, number one, there were a lot of schools of retailing at that time that were having a great deal of problems surviving. For example, NYU had a school of retailing. Rochester had a school of retailing. And the schools of retailing were kind of dying away. We didn't really want to make this. Our conception of a merchandising department was not a retailing department, per se, because we all felt and believed, when I say we, I'm talking about my staff, whatever they were, and me, that merchandising takes place at the retail level, it takes place at the wholesale level, it takes place in magazines, and therefore we did not want to make it a retailing program, and we didn't. From the very beginning, our understanding of merchandising is that it has to do with deciding either what to make and or what to buy and selling it at a profit, and that applies to all levels of the industry. And we really had a little struggle in FIT within it, because we had an apparel production department at that point, and we had a battle that we were a retailing department and they were going to be a wholesale department, and that included merchandising and marketing, and we won. In other words, the thrust of our courses was not retailing. Of course it included retailing, but as I say, it was the merchandising. I don't know whether, I have a feeling we were the first merchandising program there was. Everybody else was giving retailing courses, and as they say, they were dying away because students were very much turned off on retailing. Another interesting thing, we felt our department should really be called marketing. Now that goes back 24 years ago, and marketing was not a very popular word.
Well, the concept is still not clearly understood by very many people.
In other words, we felt that marketing was the bigger term than merchandising. Merchandising is marketing is the big umbrella, and merchandising is really the buying and selling activities under marketing, because there's a lot of other activities goes into marketing. And we argued the point. I remember Dr. Sloan and I, in a way, argued the point with Dr. Bethel, who was then president of the school, and he, in some ways, was much wiser than us. He said, if we make it a department of marketing, nobody's going to know what you're talking about. Whereas if you call it buying, everybody knows what you're talking about. And so where we hadn't named the program, and it had been named Fashion Buying and Merchandising, and we had a much broader perception of what this program should deal with, he wouldn't let us change the name, and in retrospect, I know he was right. Because, and of course that's another thing, what happens is that buying seems like a very glamorous job to high school students. When they get into buying or learn more about it, they suddenly realize that maybe it isn't quite as glamorous as they thought, because even to this day we find many students come in and they have a funny idea what buyers do. They think they spend their lives looking at beautiful clothes and at fashion shows, and it's not a business. And we all know that merchandising is a business. But their conception of it was not a business. So they very often get turned off on buying and feel, after they're here, or I really should say they get turned off on retailing. Because always the problem is, do you emphasize the excitement and the glamour part of it, or do you really tell students what it's all about? And of course you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Certainly buying and merchandising and retailing is an exciting career. But from the very beginning we had a work-study program, which means that our students go out for 6 weeks, and the opportunities for short-term employment is mostly in retailing stores, because manufacturers or buying offices don't put them on for 6 weeks, where stores will take all the help that they can get and pay them for it, of course, 6 weeks before Christmas. And that's that terrible introduction to retailing in the Christmas season when the stores are open at night and it's hectic and a lot of people are too busy to teach them anything. And so that work experience very often turns them off on retailing.
Does that still go on today, the work-study program?
We have a work-study program today, where we used to have it in the fall and in the spring, and the stores were very cooperative with us, and where they needed the help in the fall, before Christmas, they would employ our students, and in the spring, when they really do not need all these extra people, they did it. I mean, they were cooperating with us, but as we grew in size, there just were too many students to have an additional work-study period in the spring.
So now it's just one a year.
So now it's just one work-study period a year, and it's still at a terrible time. It's still the 6 weeks before Christmas. And there are more and more jobs opening up for our students in the wholesale field. And right now, we're at one time on final entry, when they graduated, about 70% of our students went into the retailing field, and maybe 30%, or maybe it was even 75, 25. 75 went into retailing when they graduated because that's where the jobs were. And maybe 25% went into the wholesale field, showrooms, Girl Fridays, or however they got started. It has turned around. We find that the manufacturers in this industry want our students, and so we are almost about 50% going into retailing, and the other 50% go into manufacturing. And most of us in the merchandising department are very unhappy about this. We would like to see more go into retailing, because we feel that the schooling plus an experience in retailing is an open door to any job in this industry. So we do our best to encourage them to go into retailing. And of course there's another thing happening. We have now, as of the last maybe 4 years, 5 years at the most, a upper division which gives the students 4 years of college, and they get a bachelor's.
And that's 2 years of liberal arts and 2 years of
No, it's 2 years of marketing. The upper division is a a much broader program. We go really from merchandising and spread out into marketing.
But doesn't the 4 years, don't those 4 years encompass liberal arts?
Oh yes, they include liberal arts as well, of course. But it's also advanced marketing courses. And I mean, they take accounting
Mhm.
and marketing management and market research
Mhm.
and marketing strategies.
Mhm.
Um, but the point I'm making is that the majority of our students are still two-year students.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, there are many top retail stores who will not employ for their executive training squad students with two-year degrees.
Right.
I think they do it for two reasons. They want students with bachelors. Not only, I think very often it's because they're more mature. They're 2 years older. So I'm not sure why, why, if that's the reason that they're looking for older students or students with more schooling. It's probably a combination of both. So we find, because of that, that more and more of our students possibly are going into wholesaling, where they don't really care whether they have a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. And that's our present situation. As I said, there are many good retail organizations where our 2-year students joined, became buyers, did very well, and cannot get into, for the most part. There are occasional exceptions because they only have a 2-year degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so our 4-year students, who are fewer in number, except they are growing, have more entry jobs open to them with prestigious retailing stores. Macy's will employ only 4-year graduates from us. Bloomingdale's will only interview 4-year graduates. I would say that's true of other stores in New York and out of town.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, what else can I tell you?
But incidentally, do those people know it? I mean, do the students know that they cannot
Yes.
go to those
You know,
stores?
it's interesting. We bring in a lot of guest speakers, amongst whom are many of our alumni who are either buyers in stores. We have a few vice presidents. We have a vice president in Macy's. We have a vice president of Gimbel's. We have a vice president of the Gap amongst our alumni. We have buyers in practically every store in New York City. And we bring them in as guest speakers. Now, they graduated maybe 5 or more years ago at a time when the stores were, perhaps the stores were either hiring more people or they had more candidates than they had positions, or more positions than they had candidates.
Yeah, that's
is really what I meant to say. So many of those graduates were holding good executive positions who are only 2-year graduates. The first question that comes up when we open it for a question and answer period is that 2-year, 4-year situation. In other words, our students are very concerned about 2-year versus 4-year. And I think more and more of them are going into the upper division, but we still have many more in our lower division than our upper. And what the next few years will be, I don't know. In other words, our president still talks about that we are basically a 2-year college. Those of us in the merchandising department feel that perhaps they're not being quite realistic about it in terms of entry-level positions for our 2-year students. See, I don't think that's true of any other division. I don't think the design students face that problem of a 2-year, 4-year. I know that the production students do not face that problem of a 2-year versus competing with a 4-year, but I do know that we face it. And I think, as I say, that it's something that this school is going to have to face up to, in my opinion. What are we going to do? Are we a 2-year college? Shall we reduce our 2-year and expand our 4-year programs in merchandising? Because there is a limit, and we're loaded to capacity and I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but I think we must be accepting maybe 1 out of 6 or 7 of the students that are applying to our 2-year program, merchandising program. Incidentally, another thing that's interesting about the merchandising department, and when it was early, there were absolutely no textbooks in this field.
What about Troxel?
Well, that's a much later one. What happened was that...
You mean that was published later than the early days you were talking about?
I'm really talking about the 60s, when there really weren't any good texts. I think Wingate wrote a text on fashion merchandising, which left much to be desired, because I don't think he'd ever been in a merchant in all his life. So it was very esoteric in terms of real life. It had really very little to do with it. And I think there was a very elaborate text on merchandising math, merchandise planning and control procedures, and those of us that had been doing it couldn't even understand the text, so we didn't think our students could. So what we did was we prepared a tremendous amount of instructional materials, which have evolved into textbooks which are used in the field. I know that when we were teaching merchandise planning and control, I'm talking about the mathematics.
You're talking about the late 50s and through the 60s.
I'm talking about, yes, really in the early 60s. We did a book. We started with a mimeo on merchandising math. We then had it put together in a binder. One of the department secretaries typed it. We had it printed, and we sold it at a very nominal cost, no profit, through the bookshop. The so-called authors of this book never got royalties. We were not publishers. Actually, the history of that book is interesting because...
Is that the one that's called Fashion Buying and Merchandising?
No, that is the one that is called The Mathematics of Retail Merchandising. Eventually, and not so many years ago, Fairchild published that book. At that book, The Mathematics of Retail Merchandising, which started as mimeoed instructional materials, which we had bound into a paperback book, which the college, which we really in a way published, and the college sold it to the students, just covered the cost of production. And that book has brought us a lot of fame. Fairchild has published the book. It's had 2 editions. It's now going into its 3rd edition. And the interesting thing is we're doing a lot of seminars for industry about that book. For example, we've done a seminar, an industry seminar for Liz Claiborne. And they used the book as the basis for learning about retail math. That's the language of retailing. I remember Jansen ordered 50 copies of that book from our bookshop. Even though it's published by Fairchild, it's sold through the bookshop. And I gather what they did was distribute it to all their salesmen. We've done other industry seminars for particular firms on retail math. And that started in the early 60s from instructional materials. We did then also, we were giving sales promotion courses, and one of our teachers did a paperback book which we had printed ourselves, sold through the college shop, called, I think it's called Advertising and Sales Promotion by Professor Winters. We had 2 or 3 revisions of that still in the original paperback. The teachers got no royalties on it. As I said, we wrote books because we needed it. Nobody told us you don't write books for instructional materials. We did it. I mean, we didn't know it couldn't be done. We did it. It wasn't that there were any rules about it, but you know, now when you think about publishing books, it's a whole big thing going on. And that book is now being published by Professor Winters and a later part, a full-timer in our department, co-authored by Professor Goodman. And that book is published. I'm not quite sure who his publisher is. I did a book that was called, well, I remember when I first had it printed in the department, all I did was use reprints of articles and put them in an order about this industry, because there really wasn't any information on this industry. And so we put a lot of reprinted material by categories. We had articles about retailers, we had articles about the textile field, we put in articles about the manufacturing field.
What was the name of the book? Do you remember?
Sure, I remember the book. It was called Fashion is Their Business. And somehow or other, and again sold at a nominal cost through the bookshop, without any royalties to anybody. I didn't write. I really just
But you edited.
collated it and edited it. And then I began to write a sort of an introduction to each chapter. Well, somehow or other the book got known as FIT got known, and many other schools began to order it right from our bookshop, because we were the publishers of that book. And if I'm not mistaken, the first year we did it, we gave it to the students free. We just handed it out in the classroom. We did it in a loose leaf notebook, and that was going to be part of their text for the course. Eventually, that book, Wiley, approached me, I guess, and I got a contract and I wrote a book called, they wouldn't use the title Fashion is Their Business. They wanted their own title. They were afraid, I don't know what they were afraid of, but they wanted a new title, so it's called Inside the Fashion Business. And it's had 3 editions, and it's widely adopted, and it started an awful lot of other books. That was the first book on this industry, I believe, that was published. I don't, when I say this industry, I'm talking about the fashion industry, about the textile industry, about the manufacturing of apparel and accessories, about the retailers. To the best of my knowledge, there never was a book before this one. And
Not this kind of book, but your library has some books about very early beginnings of the garment industry, for example, in the late...
when I talk about the industry,
you mean
the
as
fashion
the modern
industry, I am covering the fiber people, the apparel manufacturers, the textile people, and the retailers, and what, for lack of a better word, we call auxiliaries, because I'm talking about the fashion consultants, the fashion information services, the resident offices, the advertising agencies, none of whom either buy or sell merchandise, but certainly, or the fashion magazines, certainly deeply involved in our industry. Now there were early books maybe on the garment industry, per se.
Without names, yes.
But I'm talking about
Sure.
the industry, what we consider to be
Fashion.
the fashion industry. And when we talk about markets, we're not talking about 7th Avenue, we're talking about wholesale markets and retail markets and consumer markets. In other words, it's much more of a marketing approach. Not just a market is what you find on the wholesale dress market. So you're right. There were early books about maybe very specific segments of the industry, but none about the industry as a whole. Now, there have been a lot of books since then.
Well, of course, FIT has also developed its whole resource structure, its resource center, so that there is an enormous amount of material now in the library, as, for example, the vertical file section.
I want you to know the vertical file section was started by the merchandising department.
Was it?
It certainly was.
Well, you see, that's one thing that's really very interesting, is to see how all of these things evolved and developed. Now, you had told
in
me...
other words,
Well,
again,
let's go back chronologically. When you came in 56, there was not yet a fashion buying and merchandising department. It's when you
Right.
started. Okay. After that, what are some of the other things that have evolved? And as, for instance, you are just now saying...
well, the
file.
vertical files evolved. It goes back to the same thing I said when I said there were no books, that we were developing instructional materials which turned into books and have eventually been published and are being used by other schools. Since much of the information about this industry is very current, and that's what vertical files are all about, what we were doing was collecting and clipping articles about the industry.
Was the faculty?
There were some part-time faculty, yes, we were all doing this.
When did the library start as a library, do you know?
The vertical files?
No, the whole library.
Well, there was a one-room library in the old building, but there was very little in it that we could use. It was mostly a design resource. I don't even remember. I'm not sure when those vertical files started.
About 1965, I believe.
But it had to be in the middle 60s
Yeah,
because we started it. In other words, as we were all collecting materials and putting them in our files, in our office, by categories, retailing was one category to start with, very simple. Textiles was another. Manufacturing was another. And we were clipping articles and getting either photostatic copies for our files that were for the use of the teachers. What we did was we heard about vertical files, and we had no vertical files in our library. I remember going down, appointing a teacher. Her name was Miller, Professor Miller. She's still with us, to investigate this so-called thing called vertical files. I remember we were looking for current information, and we were told we could find them in something called vertical files. But we didn't know where there were vertical files. I remember going down to Dun and Bradstreet, I think it was, and they had a wonderful setup on vertical files, and we decided that would be a great resource for us to collect current information and have the library do it. I'm not even sure who was the head of the library, but we went to them and asked them to set up vertical files. And for a while, what we were doing was supplying them with the articles from Woman's Wear, from the Times, from the magazines that we felt should be in the vertical files. And that's how the vertical files got started, where we investigated schools, saw what some libraries had, not on this field.
Right.
Nobody had it. We didn't even have I didn't even know what vertical files were. We were sort of setting it up without knowing what we were doing. And eventually the library did it. We used to keep duplicates in our own department because what we were doing was really supplying them material till we got somebody to do it. I don't know when we started it.
1965, I believe was the date.
But we must have started exploring the whole idea of having current information available to students and faculty a couple of years before then. And so that was something that we, definitely instigated.
When you're talking about the mid-60s, there was apparently, FIT was apparently not really affected at all, or almost not at all, by the student unrest of the late 60s.
Not at all. Very little.
Why do you think that was?
Remind me later to go back to industry seminars, which is another thing we initiated.
Okay.
Trying to think why
Perhaps it's just because they were very career-oriented.
Well, I would say that our students were really, I think all that student unrest in the 60s was really started by young people who were more intellectual than our students. While I don't think our students were as intellectual as the liberal arts students, for example, at Columbia. I don't even know if NYU was involved in this. I know how deeply the students in the Ivy League schools were, certainly in Columbia. And our students were maybe very, my feeling is, and you may or may not agree with me, that a lot of that student unrest came out of, first of all, they were below draft age. So they really weren't involved in the draft in Vietnam. Remember, we were taking, I don't remember what the draft was, 21?
19.
Well, I guess most of our students were only 18 when they came in. So maybe they were. Secondly, we had very few boys.
I was about to say you didn't have a very high male population.
You see, we had a very low male population. So I would guess that outside of the production department, which was 100% male, and a very small department, it wasn't really affecting the women in the school, the draft. And I believe a lot of this was as a protest against the draft, and our students weren't worrying about the draft. Maybe they were for their boyfriends, but they themselves weren't. As I said, our students, the majority of our students, except for the apparel production department, which was very small and 100% male, the rest of the students in the school were mostly women. And since women were not subject to the draft or involved that much in the draft, they really were not protesting the draft, except perhaps they were concerned about their boyfriends, but it didn't involve them. Furthermore, I believe that the majority of our students were from a lower income class, and I think they were more concerned with getting a job and making a living and just really maybe weren't worrying about the world in general and what was going on. They weren't even that much involved in politics, because I remember even where we would try to get them to vote for offices in the school, there was a great deal of apathy in terms of anything political. So, and I think I did mention that since they're mostly women, I think I already said that, the draft was not an immediate threat to them.
Now, as we go into the 70s, what were some of the interesting things that were happening in school then? Because now we're coming up to the present.
I can't even think.
And, well, for example, you did mention the industry seminars.
Well, I think we did that in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken.
But the seminars continue to this day.
Yes, but not the merchandising.
I see.
Not really.
Because weren't there times when you were even training groups of people from stores like Sears?
Well, I can't really talk about what the seminar department did. We trained, I'm just trying to think whether it was Allied sent in people for a merchandising seminar. Now, what happened? You're not taping this,
Yes.
right? Oh, you are? Okay. We got the idea, FIT has two purposes. One is to recruit and prepare people for the industry, and the second is to be of service to the industry. And I'm not quite sure whose idea it was to begin with, but we, maybe collectively, when I say we, I'm talking about my faculty, and we got the idea that a merchandising seminar for the industry would be performing a service for the industry. I believe there may have been one previous industry seminar per se that involved the textile industry, but we planned and programmed a merchandising seminar designed for junior executives in the retail stores, in which we covered what our merchandising program really was covering. In other words, we did it with guest speakers as well as our faculty. We were giving them product information in terms of textile and costing apparel procedures, merchandising techniques as far as planning and control, creative merchandising, in which we brought in merchandising executives from the guest speakers, and it was a 3-day seminar, and one of our own faculty members in merchandising coordinated it, Al Sloan. And every major store sent in, because we limited the number of people from any one store to 2, and we would have an audience of about 30, and they paid pretty well for the seminars. The faculty got paid moderately well. I mean,
but this was done in the 60s, did you say?
60s.
Yeah. Okay.
Certainly, I remember Lord and Taylor sending people. I remember Andrew Goodman sent his son and his son-in-law into that. I can't remember the store from Canada that sent people in. And we repeated this. One of the things we kept talking to them about, since these were store people, traditional store people, we were very concerned, or we were very aware of what was going on with chain stores that were going into the fashion business who had really never been in it. We were even concerned with even at that time, the discounters who were going into the fashion business. I remember that when I was a buyer for a traditional department store, the only competition that I ever worried about was another department store or another specialty store. I really didn't have to worry about too much about the Lomans, the Sears, because they really weren't in. And it was during the 60s that I think it was then called a revolution in retailing at that point, where everybody and their brother were going into the fashion apparel business. And we felt that the stores were completely ignoring this kind of situation. And I remember we talked about that in the store. We also talked about what was beginning with imports there. Because I remember at that time, the blouse industry decided they would run a Buy America campaign. In other words, completely ignoring the fact that they were really getting real competition, and the way they were going to meet it was to proselytize customers to buy American. So I think we covered subjects that were very important in those seminars, and we got pretty good attendance. The problem with the seminars why we ourselves were a little upset about doing it, because we didn't feel that it was up to us, it was our responsibility to recruit people. So we were not only doing the planning of the programs, the teaching of the programs, and we were perfectly willing to invite all the guest speakers in, but we didn't think it was our responsibility to have to go out and recruit an audience. And our seminar department was really not well organized, and they were not supplying an audience. I think all they were doing was scheduling and the logistics of it, but they really weren't involved. And I guess as retailers got more, I mean, we still do merchandising seminars at FIT, but none that are strictly run by the merchandising department.
No, the seminar department has certainly grown.
So the seminar department has really enlarged, and I think on the whole that retailers have set up their own more sophisticated training programs, and they're not coming into FIT to do it.
What has happened though over the years is that as conditions in the outside world have changed, apparently the major departments have rethought their course of study and changed the course of study to conform to the needs. Would that be a fair statement? I mean, for instance, you now have a course on import-export buying. That was not true.
Oh
10, 15
yes.
years ago.
Well, one of the things we have tried to do all along is, first of all, keep our program updated to what's going on in the outside world. Now, how do you keep au courant with what's going on? Well, several different ways. Number one, as you keep adding faculty, you have people with more recent experience. Number two, we set up advisory committees. We set up advisory committees of our alumni who would come into a faculty meeting and evaluate what they had studied here in terms of what they were able to apply when they got out, in terms of suggesting new areas of study. So we've been getting our advice and keeping au courant with people right on the job.
Is there an advisory board
Right now.
structure that involves many departments, or that, for example, I recently met a young woman who was a student here for advertising and public relations, and she talked about the board that Professor Winters set up. Now, does that same kind of advisory board mechanism work in other departments? Is that what you're
I
saying?
really can't say, but I would imagine
But
they're
but
doing
you know
it
that-
either formally or informally. Now, another thing that we have done and keep doing in the merchandising department is invite in people, top executives from industry, to attend our faculty meetings one at a time and keep us updated. For example, we've had Marvin Traub in, president of Bloomingdale's,
Chairman.
or chairman. We've had Charles, I think it's Charles Greenberg or Fred Greenberg, I'm not sure of his name, who ran Loman's.
Who runs Lomas, and it's
And
Charles
still,
Greenberg.
Charles, he's been in at a faculty meeting. We had a very interesting man come in, and that was Eugene Ferkoff, who certainly is almost a legend in this industry in some way, and who I think is involved in this new emerging form of warehouse kind
Well,
of
I
clubs.
think he first started Corvette, and
Yes, but
he was part of this
warehouse
new,
thing.
Yeah, but he's pulled out of that. That's no longer.
Well, he's been in and out of a lot of things.
Yes, right.
We had the president then of Burdines come in, and these people have come in and spent 2 hours with our faculty, where anything we think we would like to know, they've been most cooperative about giving information. And as a matter of fact, currently, we're very much in the process of updating. We have a grant from the State Department of Education. It's under the Vocational Education Act, I think, of the federal government, in which we've selected 5 major topics where we think broad changes that are taking place. And what we're doing now is one a month, beginning in October, where they will come in an evening meeting with the faculty for 2 to 3 hours and update us on what's going on in their field and allow us to ask questions. These are then followed up with faculty meetings in which they're evaluating what they've learned, what have they learned perhaps that's new that should be incorporated into our curriculum. For example, should we be putting in new courses? Should we be integrating it into other existing courses? And when we get through with the 5 of them, we'll be through with them in April of 85. We will then sit down with an ad hoc committee and revise our curriculum where necessary accordingly. Now, for example, we had the topics we picked, and I can tell you the three that I'll tell you the four that we've already. I happen to be a project director of this. We picked off-price merchandising, and we had a Monroe Milstein, who's president of Burlington Coat Factory, come in on that one. We've picked another topic that we just did October 30th evening on what's going on with private labeling, why and how and what's being done and who's doing it. And we invited in Mary Ellen Bernard, who's Senior Vice President and General Merchandise Manager of Frederick Atkins, who are making tremendous strides with their private label program. And she came in with a Mr. Ron Butler, who is president of the Frederick Wholesale Corporation. Coming in December is a man by the name of Mr. Jack Schultz, who is Senior Vice President and GMM of Sanger Harris, Dallas, because they are kind of leading the pack in restructuring merchandising organization and buyers' jobs. And Federated is doing a lot of this, but we understand that Sanger Harris, as they say, is kind of the prototype for everything they're doing. And he's coming in December. Another topic we feel we would like to learn more about and update ourselves, and then update the curriculum, is electronic retailing. And in February, I don't know whether it'll be February or March yet, because our school's closed in February, we're planning to have in 2 or 3 people, certainly one will be CompuCard, who are doing a great deal of retailing electronically. We haven't quite decided on the 5th topic yet. It may be more in the operations field, purchase order management, changing methods of distribution. So we're very active in trying to keep Ocaron by means of our advisory committees, alumni, by means of these industry speakers who come in and talk to the faculty. And certainly this is an organized thing that's going on right now with this grant. It's called an in-service grant to update faculty and update curriculum.
Before I lose it, because we're almost finished, how many people are there now in the FBM department, approximately?
Well, we have a very large part-time evening staff. I would estimate that our full-time day faculty must be about 25 full-time day faculty.
In this department? Right.
In the merchandising department. However, we have many part-time faculty. In the evening, I think between our part-timers day and evening, in addition to our full-timers, we have over 100 faculty. The evening people are mostly professionals who are active in the field and who come in fact they're all working in the field, who come in and do the evening courses once a week. The day faculty members, some of them are also in the active as either consultants, or they've certainly all had a lot of background experience, whom we either have no room for as full-timers, or who are only interested in teaching part-time. So we have an enormous faculty. Yes. Well, we have a big student population. And the interesting thing is that our placement record is pretty good. And considering that they're all women, I find it quite surprising that they stay on their jobs as long as they do. I don't think any of the faculty can walk through a retail store, any one of them. And I don't care whether it's in New York or out of town, that you don't meet an FIT graduate. I know a couple of years ago I was in London, and I was walking along Oxford Street, and I suddenly hear somebody saying, Professor Jarnow, Professor Jarnow, and it turned out to be one of our graduates who is in the handbag business.
Mhm.
She had been a buyer of handbags for Orbach's. She now owns her own handbag company. And, you know, she was in London on her way possibly to Italy. And as I said, no matter where you go, we meet FIT graduates. They're all over the world, and they're certainly all over this country. I know I go to California once a year and sort of have a reunion with graduates who are out in California who have been students of mine who are at Bullock's.
Oh,
In addition to having students all over, we have some of our graduates teaching for us in the evenings. Many of them are on jobs. For example, a fellow by the name of Don Zaccardi, who's a vice president at Macy's.
how do you spell Zaccardi?
Ciccardi, who's a vice president at Macy's, teaches here at night. A fellow by the name of Jack Rosenthal, who is, I believe he's a vice president right now at Alexander's of Operations, teaches for us at
And
night.
who is the next student?
Yes, these are all former students. A gal by the name of Donna Radum, who is in the middle of having her babies, but was a fashion director at Field Crest. And Monta Edison, I believe, teaches here. We have other graduates, I can't think of them, who are back here, who, along with their professional experience, are back here teaching. I believe, yes, there's another one. We have J.C. Penney seems to love our graduates for their fashion office. And there's a gal, Susan Piazza, who's one of their fashion directors, who was teaching here in the evenings. And that's kind of fun when you have graduates who have gone in the field, made good, and are back here giving back a little possibly of what they got. And we recently had a very funny incident. We made the headlines of the Post, the News. I understand there's a story coming out in People about a lady called the Mayflower Madam. Her name is Sidney Biddle-Barrow. Sidney Biddle-Barrow was a student of ours, FBM, one of our outstanding students, won a Bergdorf Award. When she left us, I think she graduated in '76, went into Abraham and Strauss, did extremely well, and left there, and we've just kind of found out who she is. She's running the most expensive call girl operation in New York, $1,000 a job, and I said she's doing $1 million worth of business. We hear or we read, so we feel we've really taught her how to run a business.
I think that's marvelous. There's nothing like merchandising to touch on all fields. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.